Lenny here. We're talking about the transition to mastery or competence style grading. What we're looking at often is moving from a traditional grading system with percentages, averages, letter grades, GPAs, class ranks even, all of those things. What does it take to transition over? Now, some schools may be in a different setting where they maybe have standards-based report cards or other have a point scale system as opposed to a letter grade. Those aren't necessarily the end goal, but I think we'll talk more about that a little bit later. I'm going to divide this into two videos because of the length of the content here. And so for now, I'm going to focus on the four areas that are important for you to consider when you're looking at trying to transition out of traditional or standards-based grading into a more of a mastery and competence type of grading. So let's get into that. First of all, one of the important pieces to all this is that as you look at your content, and in particular in high schools where grading is the most sensitive, you look at courses. What you're looking at is you need to break down your courses into learning targets or learning outcomes throughout that course. Now, in middle school and elementary, you're looking more at a content area over the course of, let's say, a semester or so. What is the content that they have to get through, and can you break it down into anywhere from, let's say, 6 to 12 different learning targets, or some buildings use the term learning outcomes. And so each one of these learning targets can be a single standard, that is often what you see, or it can work where you have standard clusters. But the idea being that you've broken down the semester's worth of content into these learning outcomes. Now, really, when you look at grading, there's one system that covers multiple purposes for grading. And what I want to do is break down those purposes, because maybe the grading system that we come up with is not necessarily the same across all of the purposes. So first of all, the learning targets that I described, those are extremely important when you're looking at the grading system. And so these first two purposes revolve around those pieces. And then the darker icons that I have here revolve more around the course or the content area. And so we're going to walk through these four and get a better feel for what we need our grades to do. First of all, within each learning target, we have work that the learners are doing in order to gain their knowledge and skill and concepts building. And so often it may be daily work, maybe quizzes, it may be projects, those types of things that they're working on in order to gain knowledge in those areas. Now, when you look at that, what we need is a way, first of all, a system that communicates this short-term progress to the learners, but it also needs to be a feedback piece for the teacher. So the bottom line with all of this is you have to have a very solid feedback loop process in order for this to really work. And the feedback loop is more than just, here's the quiz, correct your mistakes. This is actually working with the learners and diagnosing what exactly is it that I'm short on and what I need to achieve mastery and what would be best for me to get to that point. So you have to have a success criteria. In other words, you need to lay out what it is that they need to be successful in this. That's kind of the laying out for them the end goal of what they're trying to work toward. And then you use feedback loops to help them see, where am I coming up short on this and what do I need to work on next? Now, with all this is what we consider progress tracking. It's a way of making sure you know exactly where the student is and that the learner themselves know exactly where they're at. Now, at that learning target level, once they've gone through that type of work and they've reached a place where they're ready to demonstrate their mastery, and it's either through some kind of assessment or a test of some type, once they've demonstrated their mastery, then the question is, how do we communicate that? Now, at the very minimum, you need almost like a 2-point scale, a yes or a no. If you're a computer person, it's binary. It's a 0 or a 1. The whole point of this is laying out at least some way of communicating mastery or not yet. Now, often schools have 3, 4, or even 5-point scales in order to communicate this. Often schools have a 4-point scale with 3 being mastery. That may be another way of communicating that as well. Also, there may be what I call progress scales, where the number isn't associated with how well they did. It's associated with how much of the work have they gotten done. So if they get through about a third of the work, they get a 1. If they get through about 2/3 of the work, they've got a 2, and eventually they accomplish a 3. That's a progress scale, and that's very different than the most scales that schools use out there. Now with learning targets, we have a series of those in order for a learner to get through this course or this content area over a period of time. I'm using an example here where we have 10 learning targets in this class. And you can see with the check marks that this learner has gotten through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 of those learning targets so far. But they have 3 more left to go. And so the question is, if we don't have averages, we don't have letter grades, how do you communicate how a learner is doing in a course? So the way you can look at this is you go by how much of the learning targets, how many of those learning targets have they actually mastered so far? And so in this particular case, if someone were to ask me, how's my learner doing with your course right now? And what you can say to him is 70% of the learning targets they have mastered so far, which translates into that means there's 30% left that they need to work on. The beauty of this system is that when you use this as your monitor to how they're doing in a course, you can monitor it over time. And so you can say, you know what, last month they only had 40% and now they're up to 70%. That gives you an idea of their progress. It's also a good way of communicating to learners a pace. If you're going to get through 10 of these and the ideal time to be finished is at this point, you need to have this many learning targets finished by this time in order to finish on pace. It's also useful for communicating to parents or even outside agencies. Some schools you might be dealing with, the court systems for various reasons or other entities. And this is a great way of communicating. You can tell what percentage of the course have they mastered so far and how much they have left. Also, one of the things that often we use letter grades or percentages for is sometimes students run into situations where they have a drop-off, something outside in their home setting or maybe within their outside of school that's causing them to drop off. The way to monitor that here is the slowdown of mastery. So what you're looking at is they might have zoomed through the first 5 learning targets within the first month, but now it's taken them a month and a half to go through the next 2. It's a great way of monitoring if something is going on with a learner and whether something is interfering with their school. The last piece in this then is once a student has gotten through all 10 learning targets, they've demonstrated mastery, then you have to have something that shows in the end what they got in that course. Now, many schools are still tied to needing a GPA, and I think over time that will maybe disappear. But for this point, for many schools, they still feel a need to have a GPA tied to this. And so what you will need is some kind of GPA translation, something that takes what this mastery work has done and turn it into some kind of grade. So when you look at it, our current system of traditional grading, the same thing covers all 4 of those areas. As you start to develop your own systems of grading, what you may find is what you need for communicating course progress is not necessarily what you need for communicating progress within a learning target. And the way we establish mastery may be different than what we need for course completion. So it all just depends on how we put all these pieces together. And so any planning team that's looking at planning for an alternative grading system, you need to really look at these 4 areas and what people are looking for. It may serve a different purpose in one place than it does in another. Hopefully this helps you in getting over that initial hurdle of discussion as to what our grading system is and what we're looking for. Watch for video 2 on this where we go into more depth on each one of these pieces.